Hello, class. Welcome back to REL 3066, Christianity and the Caribbean, Slavery, Race, and Christian Attitudes over the 500-year period between 1500 and the 20th century. So let's dive in today. Today we're going to be starting out in Savannah, Georgia, and moving from there to Jamaica. And we're going to be talking about Baptists. And we're going to be talking about a particular Baptist that I find very appealing, a African slave by the name of George Liele or Lyle. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. It's Liele, so you can choose your pronunciation. For consistency, I'm going to try to say Liele. So George Liele was a slave in South Carolina as the War of Independence of the colonies, 13 colonies, was breaking out against the British. And the British had the interesting idea to offer freedom, freedom from slavery, um, to any African slaves or African descendant slaves that they might find. And I have a phone call coming in. Can you hold on? Thank you. And let me put this on Do Not Disturb. So, George Liele was a slave in the American South, and his owner was a Baptist Christian. I know that sounds so strange to us in our 20th, first century ears, but his owner was a Christian, and he was a loyalist. That means he favored the British. And so his owner decided to go fight for the British and persuaded his slave, George Liele, to fight with him and the promise of freedom. Also along the way, George Liele was converted to Christianity in a Baptist church. Apparently, it was a multiracial Baptist church because there were no black churches at that point in time. But apparently, George Liele and other members of the slave community were welcome to attend the Baptist church. George Liele experienced a conversion, and he began to preach and teach in the Baptist church. And his owner was so impressed with his preaching that he granted him his freedom in order to be able to travel around South Carolina and eventually in Georgia to preach in a number of places. Uh, Apparently, he was preaching in white churches as well as among black gatherings. There were no black churches at this point. So George Liele and his owner moved to Savannah, Georgia, where Liele planted the first African or Ethiopian Baptist church in the United States, which is still there, I believe. It changed its name from Ethiopian to Africa. We'll talk more about the concept of Ethiopia either in this lecture or the next one. And the War of Independence against the British came to a conclusion unsuccessfully for the British, which meant the British had uh, to leave the colonies and vacate. They had to retreat because they lost the war. The slaves or the African blacks who fought for the British were then hoping to leave with them because they were most likely going to be re-impressed into slavery by the American colonists. This story kind of turns our traditional idea of good guys and bad guys on its head. If you are an American citizen, you haven't probably learned this in history, but the Americans were considered the slaves who fought for the British to be stolen property, and were going to re-impress them into slavery at the end of the war. Any of those that remained behind were not guaranteed their freedom. The British, therefore, then began to leave the 13 colonies. Some went to Nova Scotia, some went to the Bahamas, And uh, here was George Liele with his wife and 4 children who were still slaved. By the way, let me back up for a second. His owner died, and the family attempted to re-enslave George Liele, but he produced his manumission papers that he had been given to him legally by his owner, and therefore he was set free. He then associated himself with let me see if I could find it here, um, a, a Colonel Lakeland, I believe it was, a British colonel. I don't know if he was, in fact, I don't know if he was British. He was a loyalist and he fought for the British. Lakeland loaned him 700 pounds. And no one knows for sure, but the speculation is that Leo borrowed the money to buy the freedom for his wife and children, and promised to serve Colonel Lakeland as a indentured servant for 4 years, I believe, 4 or 7 years, in order to pay off the debt. And then Lakeland moved to Jamaica along with Lael and his family and a number of people who still were slaves. And let me see if I can find the number. It says here in the books that I've read about George Liele that there are 4 children: George Jr., John, Lucy, and possibly Paul, and 3,000 loyalists and their 8,000 slaves traveled to Jamaica. So Liele, after having a successful church planting ministry in southern Georgia, now is on his way to Jamaica. I do want to pause here and mention another slave who was a friend of George Liele, perhaps even a mentee or disciple, if we want to use that term, David George. He was previously a slave of George Washington. He got his freedom fighting for the loyalists. So my guess is, I don't know the whole story, but he must have fled from George Washington's plantation and volunteered to fight for the British in exchange for his freedom. He became a Christian also, David George, former slave of George Washington. And at the end of the war, George moved to Nova Scotia for 10 years. He developed a worshiping community, planning a church which, despite the racial tensions, had 60 members, both black and white, a multiracial church. It's fascinating to me that in 1780s you find so many multiracial churches. This is at the very end or a little bit after the First Great Awakening, and was still part of the expansion of Baptist and Methodist churches out of the Great Awakening. He later then relocated to Sierra Leone in East Africa and began to evangelize and plant churches in Africa. So Lael moves to Jamaica with his associate Colonel Kirkland, and works to pay off his debt to Colonel Kirkland. In the meantime, he begins to evangelize in Kingston. He starts a church in Kingston. It grows rapidly, and in 7 years, they have 400 baptism, 450 converts, which is nothing to sneeze at. I think most evangelicals today would be jealous of planning a church and having it grow to 450 converts in 7 years, mostly new conversions. He carried out baptisms in the sea at Kingston and the river in Spanish Town. He also gained an additional 1,500 members in the countryside, where his converts were primarily the enslaved. Around this time, this was the 1780s. Shortly after this, there's the Haitian Revolution, 1791. This has great severe consequences in both Jamaica and Cuba. The planter class, the Spanish planter class in Cuba and the English planter class in Jamaica become fearful of the possibility of a slave revolt or uprising in their own islands, and this then brings about persecution of any slaves or former slaves that are suspected of associating and organizing themselves in a way that might be a threat to the system. We will come back to that story later on. And so Leo did undergo a severe amount of persecution. during this time, and his associates. Liele was also a master mentor. He was a man who did not need to soak up all the spotlight or all the air in the room. He was comfortable raising up and empowering leaders around himself. And he then began to develop a kind of a school of ministry, uh, unofficially at least. And he developed a number of significant leaders who went on to major leadership positions in the Baptist Church, the Black Baptist Church in Jamaica in the subsequent years. One was Moses Baker. We'll talk about him in a hymn that he wrote or led in. And let's see, there was a number of others here, and I don't seem to have their names in front of me, but there was a number of strong leaders that came out of Leile's ministry and out of the mother church in Kingston and another church in Spanish Town. So, as an example of the kind of persecution that they experienced, Moses Baker uh, led a congregation in singing Dr. Isaac Watts' hymn, Shall We Go On in Sin. He didn't even write this. He just led the congregation in singing a classic hymn from Great Britain. Shall we go on in sin because thy grace abounds, or crucify the Lord again and open all his wounds? We shall be slaves no more, since Christ has made us free. You heard that, right? We shall be slaves no more, since Christ has made us free, has nailed our tyrants to the cross and brought our liberty. And for that simple act of leading the congregation in that song, he was arrested and put on jail. The building that they sang in was set on fire. Those that were in the meeting had to run for their lives. It was considered a insurrectionary threat. And obviously, I grew up in a holiness church singing songs like this. I may have sang this song. We shall be slaves no more, since Christ has made us free and has nailed our tyrants to the cross. But you can imagine how white planters after the Haitian Revolution heard those words in a very different context and saw them as threatening. One more thing here. Hold on one second. Here it is. So, Liele was famous for hub and spoke missionary evangelism. I think this is genius. Having been a former missionary uh, and church planter myself, I would have loved to have had a situation like this. I was never quite able to achieve it. I did plant 3 churches in 20 years, but I never developed a hub and spoke missionary center out of which leaders could be sent to plant new churches. I didn't have the gifting or the measure of this man, George Liele. By the way, I want to also mention that he began his preaching in the 1770s, went to Jamaica in 1780. This was a full 10 years before William Carrey, the father of modern evangelical missions, a white working class Baptist, I believe, in England, was sent out to the mission field. I believe it was in India, but I'm not entirely sure. It's been years and years since I've read his story of William Carey. So growing up, I read a lot about the early evangelical missions. I never heard about George Liele or Rebecca, who I spoke about last week in St. Thomas, a Moravian woman of color and an apostle in St. Thomas. So George Liele brought with him a strategy developed in Savannah, Georgia, called hub and spoke evangelism, at least by the author. I don't know if George Liele called it that. The idea was to form a center, a missionary base, or a hub, and to grow it dynamically, and out of that train other leaders that then could be sent out to the surrounding area as spokes to develop new churches and new missionary centers. And Liele did this effectively. As I said earlier, he made 450 converts and 400 baptisms in 7 years. There's at least a dozen men mentioned in the book that were associated with being raised up under his ministry over these 7 year period. One of them being Of course, there was David George that I mentioned, and Moses Baker was another one. And so this reminds me of the Apostle Paul in Ephesians, where he stayed. Actually, it's in the book of Acts. It talks about him locating in Ephesus for a 2-year period. And instead of going into a house church situation, he rents a space or is loaned a space in a school. It's called the School of Tyrannus, where he taught daily in that school. I suspect that that actually was a training school, because later you find out about Epaphroditus carrying a letter to Colossae, and there's no record that Paul was ever in Colossae, and Epaphras and carried the letter there and was probably the one who began the church. There's also a record of a letter to the church in Laodicea. So there was a cluster of churches around Ephesus that there's no record of Paul himself individually starting them. So I think it's quite possible that Paul developed a hub and spoke strategy out with Ephesus as the hub, and with these young associates going forth to the surrounding areas in the spokes. And perhaps that was the inspiration for George Liele. We don't know, but he had an amazing ministry. As I said earlier, this provoked intense persecution by the white British church planters and slave owners who were Anglican, generally speaking. The Anglicans had been there for 100 years or more, but had made very little headway or shown very little interest in evangelizing the black population until George Liele comes along with the Baptists. The persecution was intense. The name of the Baptist movement, Afro-Baptist movement, Afro-Jamaican movement that George Liele started was called the Ethiopian Baptists. I've also heard them referred to as the Native Baptists. They were criticized for being too African. What does that mean? It means their worship service was very charismatic, very enthusiastic. We talk in religious studies about ecstatic worship. That comes from the Greek word ekstasis, which means out of body, and dancing, raising the hands, you know, shouting, praising God in loud voices. Later on in the 20th century, with the Pentecostal movement, speaking in tongues, falling down under the power of the Spirit, possession by the Holy Spirit. All these things are part of the Pentecostal movement in the 20th century. There's not a detailed description of which of these things were part of the Ethiopian Baptists, but it made the Anglicans and other groups, including the Moravians, somewhat uncomfortable. And so they were criticized for being too African. Could it be that his amazing growth and his success for a 7-year period of nearly 500 people being gathered into a church and over 400 converts, could it be because he was contextualizing the gospel and worship practices to the African population in Jamaica, or the Afro descendants in Jamaica? I think probably yes. However, this was greatly threatening to the other church organizations, especially the Anglicans that were in Jamaica. And my own theory in this course is that these evangelical sects, which includes the Quakers, the Moravians, the Methodists, the Baptists, and eventually the Pentecostals, as they came in waves out of the English Civil War and beyond, they had the typical characteristics of sect sociology, high commitment, high tension with society. They were focused on imparting dignity and humanity to the African slaves and Africans, people of color who were free people of color, opening their doors to them for the gospel, even though the early attempts among the Quakers and Moravians tended to justify Christian slavery rather than critique it as a evil institution. Nonetheless, my theory is that these uh, evangelical sects moved along a process. They moved the needle. from a situation where Spanish Catholics and English Anglicans and French Catholics and Dutch Reformed justified slavery as compatible with Christianity and used scriptures to endorse that. They moved the needle from that to eventually to a different point of view, which saw slavery as inhumane and incompatible with Christianity. Now, there are other factors that come into the abolition of slavery in the 1830s. Some of them economic, some of them geopolitical. It'd be a mistake to say that this was brought about only by evangelical Methodists and Baptists and Quakers and others who were working against slavery and for abolition. However, I do think it was a factor in changing attitudes among Christians towards slavery. And one major argument in favor of that is the fact that the planters were so deeply threatened. And so the planters suspected that the work of these Baptists, of empowering leaders, developing leadership, developing congregations, giving African and Afro-Jamaicans the space and agency to have their own congregations, their own leadership, their own worship, they saw this as an immediate threat to their slave structure and their slave economy. So that in itself, I think, is an argument in favor of my thesis. So I'm going to leave it here, and I'm going to come back in the next episode and talk about the persecution that they endured throughout the 19th century, leading up nearly to their extinction, the extinction of Ethiopianism and Ethiopian Baptists towards the end of the 19th century. And thank you for your time and attention. I'll be back shortly.